They said she was cursed because her breasts were too large. In the eyes of her small Apache band, beauty had turned into a sentence of doom. Her body was called a bad omen. Every drought, every death of cattle, every sickness of a child, they blamed it on her chest. The night the accusations grew loud, they dragged her into the center of the camp. Her name was Ayana, only 20 years old, barefoot on the dirt, shaking in fear. She was forced to stand while the fire cracked and men shouted. They stripped the blanket from her shoulders and threw ashes into her hair. One man spat at her feet. Another tied a string of bones around her neck, calling it the mark of shame. Her swollen cheek showed where she had already been struck. The bruises on her side turned red under the firelight. Nantan, the headman, raised his hands. He declared that the spirits were angry and that her very body was a curse upon them all. She used it to cut the rope that bound her wrist. Her skin tore. Blood streaked her arms, but she kept working. Outside, she heard Coy laugh, telling the others she would never escape. She pressed her jaw tight and forced the knot loose. When the rope fell away, she clenched her fist. She whispered to herself that she was more than a curse. She was a woman who would not kneel. The night grew colder. The wind carried the sound of coyotes in the distance. Ayana shoved the stones aside, one by one. Each sound echoed like thunder in her ears. Finally, a gap opened. She pulled the ragged cloth across her chest and slipped into the darkness. She ran barefoot across the dry earth, every step slicing her skin. She fell once, caught herself, and kept going. The moon lit her path toward the river, the place where fate would change forever. But what would she find waiting there? Mercy or betrayal? Life or death? Would anyone stand for her when her own people had cast her out? When the first light of dawn broke over the prairie, Ayana was still running. She had fled all night beneath the cold moon, and now the rising sun beat down on her like fire. Her feet were cut and raw, her throat burned with thirst, the ragged cloth clung to her body, torn and filthy. She stumbled out of the brush at the riverbank, where the water shimmered gold in the morning light. Her legs gave way, and she nearly fell into the grass. Then she heard a voice. "Hold on there, miss." She looked up, blinking against the brightness. A man stood not far away, tall and broad-shouldered, with a wide brim hat shading his eyes and a red bandana around his neck. He held the reins of a brown horse, and the animal tossed its head in the heat of the day. For a moment, fear gripped her heart. Another man, another set of eyes that might mock her body as a curse, but this man kept his distance. He raised one hand slowly, palm open, the way you calm a frightened animal. "My name is Harlan Cole," he said. "I have a ranch up the hill." "You look hurt." Her knees buckled. Harlan rushed forward and caught her before she hit the dirt. He lowered her gently to the ground and then pulled off his work shirt and held it out. "Put this on. No one should be left like this." The shirt smelled of sweat and leather, yet it gave her back a sense of dignity. For the first time in days, she felt something close to dignity. Her tears came fast, rolling down her bruised cheeks. Harlan poured water from a canteen and pressed it into her hands. She drank greedily, the cool water easing the fire in her throat. He studied her face, the marks of pain plain to see. "You have been through hell," he said. She whispered her name, Ayana. The sound shook in the air, but he repeated it with quiet respect. He led her to the shade of a cottonwood tree. There she told him what had happened, how her people believed her body cursed, how they stripped her, mocked her, and locked her away to face the fire at sunrise. Her voice cracked, but her eyes blazed. "I had to run. If I stayed, I would be dead." Harlan clenched his jaw, anger flashing across his weathered face. "No woman deserves that. Not ever." He cleaned her wounds with steady hands, then tied a bandage across her shoulder. "You are safe here," he promised. For the first time in her young life, she almost believed it. But safety is never simple on the frontier, and even as she sat in the shade, a shadow was moving closer through the tall grass. Someone had already found her trail. The shadow that trailed her did not wait long. As Ayana sat beneath the cottonwood, catching her breath, Harlan's horse lifted its head and snorted. The man turned, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip. A figure pushed through the tall grass. It was Coy, the same cruel young man who had shoved her to the ground the night before. His eyes locked on her like a wolf spotting prey. "You thought you could run," he sneered. "You belong to us. You belong to the curse." Ayanna's body froze, but Harlan stepped forward. "She does not belong to you or to anyone," he said firmly. Coy laughed, flashing a knife. "You think you can stop me, rancher?" Harlan did not draw his gun. Instead, with calm, steady hands, he coiled a rope from his belt. When Coy lunged, Harlan flicked his wrist and the loop snapped tight around the man's arm. In one pull, Coy stumbled forward and dropped the knife. The horse reared, hooves striking dirt, and Coy fell back with dust covering his face. "Leave," Harlan growled, but Coy spat and tried to rise again. This time it was not Harlan who moved. It was Ayanna. She seized a wooden staff leaning against the tree and struck the ground hard between them. Her voice shook but carried strength. "I will not go back. Not ever." Coy's eyes widened. The woman he had mocked and beaten now stood tall, wrapped in the rancher's shirt, no longer just a victim but a fighter. He cursed under his breath and backed away. "You will regret this," he hissed. Then he disappeared into the grass, vanishing toward the camp. Silence followed. The only sound was the river and the pounding of Ayanna's heart. Harlan turned to her, laying a hand gently on her shoulder. "You have more courage than any of them." She looked at him, tears burning in her eyes. But this time they were not only from fear. They were from pride. That evening, Harlan saddled his horse again. "We need the law on our side," he said. "I will take you to Sheriff Amos. He's a good man. He will help us." Ayanna nodded, still clutching the staff, unwilling to let it go. Together they rode toward the small town as the sky burned orange with sunset. For Ayanna, it was the first time in years she felt the world might hold a place for her. But Coy's words hung in the air like smoke. "You will regret this." And she wondered what would come when the rest of her people learned she had found protection. Before we move on, if you find yourself drawn to Ayanna's struggle and the fight for her freedom, take a second to subscribe. It helps you follow the rest of her story, and it helps us share more untold tales of the Wild West. Next, we will see how Sheriff Amos reacts when Harlan brings Ayanna into town. Will the law protect her, or will the shadow of her tribe still reach across the prairie? The ride into town was quiet. Ayanna held tight to the saddle horn while Harlan guided the horse along the dusty trail. The sky was still painted with streaks of red and gold. For the first time in a long while, she felt the promise of safety, but she also felt the weight of Coy's threat pressing against her chest. When they reached the wooden sign that marked the edge of Dry Willow, Harlan slowed the horse. "This is a small town," he said. "Folks talk, but Sheriff Amos is a friend. He will hear us out." Ayanna nodded, nervous but determined. The sheriff's office sat at the corner of Main Street, next to the saloon. The sound of a piano drifted through the open windows. Sheriff Amos Reed stepped out onto the porch, his badge catching the last light of the sun. He was a broad man with steady eyes, the kind that weighed every word. "Harlan," he said, shaking the rancher's hand, "what trouble have you brought me this time?" "Not trouble," Harlan replied, "a person who needs protection." Amos's gaze shifted to Ayanna. She lowered her head, clutching the shirt around her shoulders. Harlan explained everything, the accusations of curses, the abuse she had suffered, the threat of execution at sunrise. Amos listened without interruption. Finally, he nodded. "Law says a person has the right to life and freedom," he said. No matter what old superstition claims, relief washed over Ayanna, but it lasted only a moment. Because even as the sheriff spoke, heavy footsteps echoed down the street. Nantan and two of his men appeared, their faces hard, their eyes burning with anger. They stopped in front of the office. One raised a paper scrawled with symbols and shouted, "She belongs to us. The spirits demand her blood." The townsfolk began to gather. Men leaned on fences, women clutched their children. Everyone waited to see what the law would do. Amos stepped forward, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "This town does not answer to curses," he said firmly. "It answers to justice," the crowd murmured. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked away, uneasy. Nantan's men moved to grab Ayanna. but Harlan blocked their path, standing like a wall of stone. Ayanna, though trembling, stepped beside him. Her voice rang out over the street. I am not a curse. I am a woman. I will not kneel to your lies. The words struck the crowd like a whip. Even the children stared in silence. Sheriff Amos pulled the paper from Nantan's hand, crumpled it, and tossed it into the dirt. You try to touch her again, and you answer to me, he said. For a heartbeat. No one moved. Then Nantan spat on the ground and turned away, his men following close behind. The tension broke, but the fear did not vanish. Because Ayanna knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a fight that could cost them everything. What will Nantan do next, now that his pride has been shattered in front of the whole town? The dust settled slowly on Main Street. Nantan and his men had walked away, but their anger still hung in the air like storm clouds. Ayanna stood trembling beside Harlan, her chest rising with each heavy breath. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring about what they had just witnessed for the first time. She had spoken against those who wanted her destroyed. Her voice had carried, and it had been heard. Sheriff Amos placed a steady hand on Harlan's shoulder. You will need to keep her close, and he said, they may try again, but the law is with you. Harlan nodded. That night, back at the ranch, Ayanna sat near the fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of hay and smoke. Her eyes reflected the glow of the flames. She felt the bruises on her body, but more than that, she felt the weight lifting from her spirit. For the first time in years, she believed she might have a life not shaped by fear. She looked at Harlan across the fire. This man had stood against a knife, against superstition, and against a crowd, all for her. He met her gaze and gave a small nod, as if to say she was safe, not just for tonight, but for the days to come. Seasons turned slowly on the prairie. Ayanna began to heal. She fed calves in the morning, planted seeds in the soil, and rode the fields with Harlan under the wide blue sky. She laughed again, a sound she thought had been lost forever. The scars on her skin remained, but they no longer told a story of shame. They told a story of survival. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Harlan handed her the red bandana from his neck. He tied it gently around her wrist. In this land, you belong, he said. Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy. Love had grown not from pity, but from respect, from courage, and from standing side by side when the world tried to tear them apart. Her people had once called her a curse, but she had found a new truth. The only curse in this world is cruelty, and the only way to break it is with compassion and strength. Ayanna's story reminds us that no one should be defined by fear or by the judgment of others. Now, it asks us a question. What would you do if you saw someone cast out and broken at the edge of a river? Would you turn away, or would you stand beside them? And another question remains. If love and courage can rise from dust and pain in the Wild West, what can they do in our lives today? If you felt the power of this story, take a moment to like this video. And if you want more stories of the Wild West, untold and unforgettable, subscribe now so you will not miss what comes next. Because the frontier was not only about guns and gold, it was about people who fought to belong, people who dared to hope, and people who chose love when hate seemed easier, and those stories deserve to live on.